Good evening and welcome to ThinkTech's Asian Review. We're going to be discussing this evening a most unusual topic. We're going to be talking about the East European role in stability on the Korean Peninsula. And as you may or you may not know, Eastern Europe, both the government side as well as the private sector side, have had a special relationship with North Korea, and I think once you begin to understand that, you will see that that relationship could be more effectively utilized to promote stability on the Korean Peninsula. And our special guest here this evening to help us with this is Ms. Petra Dunne, who is a Kelly Fellow at Pacific Forum.
That is correct, yes.
It's very nice to have you here, Petra. And
Pleasure.
For our audience, just so you can put this in perspective, Petra used to be a citizen of the Czech Republic in Eastern Europe. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
And now you are
an American citizen. I became naturalized here in Honolulu about 2 weeks ago.
So we have someone from Eastern Europe, now an American citizen. And Petra, you used to have a very interesting connection with the United Nations. And what role did you play with the United Nations?
That's correct. First of all, thank you very much for having me, David. It's a pleasure. Good evening. I was the first Czech youth delegate and representative of the Czech Republic selected to represent my country at the United Nations. And I enjoyed it so much that I decided to stay for another about couple of years, and I became a member of the delegation. First, I was on the third committee, which covers the humanitarian, social, and cultural issues at the United Nations. And then I also switched my focus to the United Nations Security Council, which almost seemed to be the independent body. It's like a little organism within the big UN structure. And I've got my diplomatic experience at the United Nations.
So while you're at the United Nations, I think kind of interesting, you are, I take it, kind of an advisor to the Czech delegation.
That's correct, yes.
On the Security Council.
On the Security Council and also on the youth issues, because as we know, the world is getting younger and the youth needs to have more voice represented at such international and multilateral bodies. So we would provide young perception on issues that are of the world's most crucial importance.
So while you were with the Security Council in that capacity, why don't you tell our audience, in those times, where was the Czech Republic seat or desk compared to the North Koreans?
We were actually really close, David. Czech Republic was kind of sitting next to all the, democratic people's republic, so as to speak. For instance, Cuba, right? Not necessarily a democracy. We were also seated next to the Democratic People Republic of Korea. That's our topic of discussion today. Also Congo. So we were seated relatively close in terms of where you are seated. But when it comes to the EU, of course, we were part of the European Union, and we would have coordination meetings every morning with the rest of the 26 countries, so because EU has 27 countries. And we would see the North Korean delegation in the hallways and in social functions, equally represented with others. So it was a good opportunity to speak perhaps informally and talk to them about various issues that we don't really, or newspapers don't really get a chance to talk to them about.
So you can see this, ladies and gentlemen, this is an extraordinary opportunity for all of us. We have with us a woman who is originally from Eastern Europe and worked with the United Nations and involved in a lot of the Security Council discussions, and had some very close contact with the North Korean diplomats attending the United Nations.
Right, that's correct.
Okay, so Petra, for our audience now, let's talk kind of generally. Let's kind of give them the big picture for those who may not know. What is the situation that involves North Korea to set up this discussion? How would you describe this?
Sure. David, absolutely. When we hear the word North Korea, I think what first comes to mind is the nuclear program. and the implications that are connected with nuclearization and nuclear weapons. There have been several initiatives, including the six-party talks, which have stalled, that were aimed to kind of denuclearize the Korean Peninsula unsuccessfully. So nuclear weapons is definitely the primary kind of concern of the Western world.
That's kind of the focus of
right,
the Western world.
Absolutely, and also the fear that is connected to North Korea selling nuclear weapons and nuclear material to other, adversarial countries or non-state actors, essentially leading to nuclear terrorism. As we may have seen, North Korea sold weapons and materials to Iran, possibly Syria. So when we look at North Korea, first that comes to mind is nuclear weapons. What
else is there in this picture that we need to be mindful of?
Right, humanitarian crisis. There is also, 23 million people are starving. So the humanitarian crisis is really huge. People are starving, and the human rights in North Korea also are virtually non-existent. It is basically a regime that's been oppressing its people ever since it existed, or ever since the Korean armistice and the end Korean War in 1953. So we are dealing with impoverished population, as well as the lack of regular supplies, water, food, and that's something that ought to be taken into consideration as well, and that should be the primary focus also for our policies and policymakers throughout the world, and in the Western countries and the United States as well.
Okay, so we've got these three major problems that you've talked about: the nuclear issue.
Right.
We have the humanitarian disaster, potential for a humanitarian disaster if North Korea should implode.
Sure.
And as you mentioned, we have this very serious human rights problem ongoing in the country.
Sure.
So with that as kind of as a foundation for our discussion, let's turn now to the relationship that North Korea has had with the EU and particularly Eastern European countries in terms of, let's start first with the diplomatic relations today. What does that look like?
Okay, so North Korea today has established diplomatic relations with 164 countries. And within the European Union, there are 27 nations, and North Korea has diplomatic relations with 26 out of the 27. The exception is France, which sees establishment of diplomatic relations, the humanitarian crisis and the human rights. That's essentially an obstacle for France.
How many of those countries have actual embassies in Pyongyang?
There are 25 active embassies, and out of that, there are 7. So 7 of the EU countries, of the 27 countries, have active embassies in Pyongyang.
And which of those?
They would be Bulgaria, Czech Republic, Germany, there's Poland, there is Romania, Sweden, and the United Kingdom. Okay,
so we can see that the EU countries and Eastern European countries are they have a diplomatic hook into
right.
North Korea,
that is
if you
correct.
will. And so let's shift now and let's talk about the kind of the historical relationship between North Korea and focus on the former Soviet satellite states, like your home country, used to be, your former home country,
Sure.
the Czech Republic.
Absolutely. So the history, as we all know, the Eastern European countries were part of the USSR satellite bloc, and we had good relations with North Korea back then. Bulgaria and Poland were particularly good relations. Actually, what is worth noting is Romania also. Romania's Nicolae Ceausescu, who was the dictator, would frequently visit North Korea during the Cold War, and actually even looked up to Kim Il-sung as a role model, and he really was in favor of the whole Juche, the kind of self-sufficient and self-reliance, that he came back from his trip and went to Romania, and some of these doctrines were actually translated to Romanian language as well.
You mean the North Korean doctrine of Juche was adopted in Romania?
Yes, it was definitely very favored, and Nicolae Ceausescu was so in favor of it that he decided that he's going to put it in textbooks and kind of distribute it in schools and teach it. So that was really interesting. And of course, during the Cold War, there were a lot of trade exchanges and also cultural and student exchanges. There were a lot of high-level diplomatic visits between these countries and North Korea's leadership as well. One of the most important relationship was probably of Eastern Germany and North Korea.
Why is that?
East Germany provided a lot of assistance and aid to North Korea. There was a city in Hanhun which was rebuilt. It was completely destroyed during the Korean War, and the East Germans decided to take initiative and rebuild this city in 7 years. So there was a lot of camaraderie between the Eastern Germans and North Koreans. Also, the Secretary General, Erich Honecker, who was a high-level Eastern European politician and leader, would frequently visit Kim Il-sung, who later in life called him his brother and best friend. So East Germany provided a lot of aid and assistance to North Korea during the Cold War. On the other hand, there is Hungary. And Hungary had a great relationship with North Korea up until about 1956, when in October the Hungarian Revolution kind of evolved. And what's very interesting is, David, that there were about 200 exchange students at that time during the revolution in North Korea who sided with the students and were protesting against the Soviet Union and against, they were fighting for freedom.
Okay, right.
And because they were easily identified, they were different race and different origin, they were sent back to North Korea by the Hungarian and Soviet authorities. And only, I think it's documented, about 4 of them were able to escape to the West. And the rest were sent over to North Korea, where they were punished. And that's basically the revolution kind of led to souring of the relations between Hungary and North Korea. And
and that's because Hungary kind of stepped out of the Soviet bloc a little bit. Right?
That's correct. They kind of were the first one to show their disapproval of the Soviet Union and of being a part of the bloc, of the satellite bloc. And then they never really gained trust of the North Koreans ever again. And to top that, actually, Hungary was also the first country to establish diplomatic relationship with South Korea after the fall. So the North Koreans weren't very pleased about that.
I can see that
either.
What about your former homeland, the Czech Republic? What's that relationship been like?
Sure. As I mentioned, we were also Czechoslovakia back then. We split in 1993 when the country became Czech Republic and Slovakia, but up until then we were Czechoslovakia, and we also had really good diplomatic relations. There was a lot of trade, which consisted of machinery and food mostly. Also engineers. We would send some engineers and students to North Korea.
Okay.
So there was definitely an exchange of people as well as trade and investment during the Cold War.
There was a big shift in the relationship diplomatically when Czechoslovakia went to the Czech Republic?
Not really. We have an embassy, active embassy in Pyongyang at the moment. Slovakia doesn't, because we split with the Slovaks, and they are the Slovakians use the Czech embassy if they have any concerns, regarding diplomatic affairs. But there are still up to today cultural and exchange programs and educational programs. There are still some treaties in effect and agreements when it comes to North Korea with Czech Republic today.
What about, I got to ask you about one more country, and
Sure.
then we'll move on here. I'm very curious about the relationship between North Korea and Poland. What has that history been like?
North Korea and Poland, they, again, after the fall of the Iron Curtain in 1989, things and relations have kind of changed, right? And North Korea lost a lot of assistance from these Eastern European countries to its kind of programs and to development and whatnot. But Poland still remains friend, friend, quote unquote, just like Bulgaria. The relationship is relatively stable, and there are no obstacles after the 1989.
Okay, well, that is kind of a historical foundation.
Right.
I mean, I think I think all of you can see that there has been a very really kind of a long-standing historical diplomatic relationship that has existed between the Eastern European countries and North Korea. Fair general statement?
Right, absolutely, yes.
Okay, so let's jump into what is the situation like today in connection with maybe trade in, between those countries and in the EU
Right.
and North Korea?
So, David, due to the fact that there already have been relations established during the Cold War, there are still, there's a long history of trade with the European member states, Eastern European countries, and North Korea. Some of the main, I would start with exports that come from the EU to North Korea include, you have agricultural machinery, there are electronics and electrical products, there are also cars, steel, there are actually rough diamonds as well. And on the other hand, imports that come to the European Union member states and come from North Korea include, I think there are electric products as well, plastics, a lot of textile and clothing goods. So there are still the trade ties that kind of keep it together. And even though these, import-exports and trade is not important, or it's slightly, it's less to the European Union. It's about 1,000 times of trade volume of importance to North Korea. So North Koreans' trade with the European Union constitutes a lot.
Well, I mean, let's put this in perspective. I mean, it's as we look at North Korea and their trade with the, I call it the outside world.
Sure.
Their number one trading partner is whom?
Well, it's China, of course, North
Okay.
Korea and China.
And
yes.
so behind China, who is their number two trade partner?
In terms of providing aid and assistance, that would be South Korea.
Okay. And in terms of business type trade, where does the Eastern European or the EU fall?
It's estimated that it's the third actually largest partner to North Korea. So after China, South Korea, then we have all the EU together. There have been several joint ventures between North Korea and some of the EU private companies and businesses. I would like to perhaps point out to a Swiss North Korea pharmaceutical venture, which is called Pyeongsu. Then we also have Polish North Korea shipping venture, and we also have, what comes to mind is the Korean Computer Center.
Well, let me stop you right there.
Sure.
You're talking about private sector EU or East European firms that have invested in North Korea and are currently doing business there.
That's correct,
right?
yes.
So what is this Korea Computer Center? What is this all about?
It's North Korea and German IT company.
Okay.
And they focus on developing the Linux research program, a lot of software. There is this Red Star operating system, a lot of educational programs and systems that are being kind of developed in this KCC, or the Korean Company Center.
Okay, so let's jump into the area where you have companies that are combined in kind of joint ventures. And so what kind of products would we see in joint ventures between European firms and the North Korean state-owned enterprises coming together to make a new business enterprise?
Sure. So the most successful joint ventures companies or products are, unsurprisingly, tobacco and beer. So
Okay.
we have in terms of tobacco, there was the British American Tobacco Company, which was the second world's largest company.
A British American tobacco
That's correct,
company.
yes. And they came to North Korea in 2001. They were caught that they were doing illicit business, actually, in North Korea in 2005, and were operating there illegally. So you can imagine how many companies, European-based companies, and businesses might be illicitly doing business in North Korea without letting the world know.
All right. Well, let's continue this. And ladies and gentlemen, all we can do is just scratch the surface of what we understand, or what you, Petra, understand as the private sector involvement from Eastern Europe and the EU. You mentioned this British American group in the tobacco field. Who is the big player in North Korea from Europe in terms of, you mentioned beer? Who is that?
That would be Heineken, David.
Heineken
beer.
is in North Korea.
Yes, it's the most popular and drank beer in Pyongyang among all the party elites, of course. So it would be Heineken. And if I may, I would perhaps also point out that the Dutch private companies and the involvement of some of the businesses is actually small, but it's very important because, for instance, this January, in mid-January, in Amsterdam, in Netherlands, a new Pyongyang restaurant opened, and it's basically an idea of two business entrepreneurs, one of them who is Remco van Daal. He visited North Korea several times and decided to open a Pyongyang restaurant in Amsterdam. You can buy a meal there for about 79 euros. It's a 9-course meal. The staff at this restaurant is purely from North Korea. There's about 9 employees, and one of them is, a manager as well. So if you feel like a good Pyongyang meal, go to Amsterdam, and that seats about 24 people. On the other hand, actually, this Hana Electronics JVC opened the restaurant Hana in Pyongyang, and you can find a lot of bars there as well as swimming pools, sauna.
Is that a Korean restaurant in Pyongyang, or what is that?
It's actually a Dutch restaurant in Pyongyang, and it caters to elite and the foreigners.
Okay.
And it's kind of a Western style place where you can get anything you want, and you can also go visit sauna and swimming pools, and you can enjoy a nice cocktail, basically like you could if you were in the West. But again, this is catered mainly for and North Korea's elites as well as foreigners who happen to be in Pyongyang.
So there are, you've talked about a pharmaceutical firm that's there as an example. Mm-hmm. You've talked about a joint venture with Polish shipping, North Korean, the IT computer services. Right. It almost looks like a restaurant exchange program here.
Right.
And then the whole interesting tobacco piece and
Sure.
Heineken beer. Let's talk a minute, just a second here for this about DHL. What is going on with DHL?
That's right. DHL was actually open. It was invited by the North Korean leadership to kind of start their operations in 1997.
Okay.
So that's about 15 years ago. So DHL has been there for 15 years, and it's, as we all know, it's a parcel and shipping company. And it kind of led into then opening business and kind of, promoting more things such as textile, shipping, light manufacturing, and clothing. So the DHL, I think, is one of the oldest companies that have been operating in Pyongyang.
So let me see if I understand what you're saying. You're saying that DHL starts into North Korea in its the shipping FedEx type business that we're all familiar with, and then it broadens out into a whole number of other sectors.
Sure. And
DHL is currently what kind of company?
It's a shipping company.
I was talking about where is it based?
It's in Pyongyang, but I believe it was an American company that was the DHL.
Well, originally.
And then there's a German.
It's
brand.
a German firm
Yes.
now.
Yeah.
Yes, and so for our audience, just so that you know, DHL was originally founded by some Americans, and I believe its legal headquarters was in the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas, or Saipan, in that area, and then ultimately sold to a German firm. Very, very interesting to see the kind of private sector ties, and you've talked about the governmental relationship, the diplomatic relationship. Now, are these all coordinated together between the governments moving into North Korea with the relationships that they have?
It's very interesting that you mentioned this, because there is a gap between the European state, which is the government, and the politics, because of precisely because of the issues that I've mentioned, human rights and humanitarian crises, and also between the European private sector that is kind of operating on their own and independently. So it seems that the left hand doesn't really know what the right hand is doing. But if I may, I would perhaps point out one of the EU's initiatives that originated in 2002 of the North Korea's strategy paper, which essentially the European Union decided to allocate 35 million euros to to North Korea's and to rebuilding their infrastructure and kind of sustainable development programs and economic reforms as well. However, they were during that time between 2002 and 2004, there have been many high-level visits between North Korea and the European Parliament and European Commission delegations from the EU to kind of educate North Korea about economic reforms and economic opening. This unfortunately stalled in 2004 when North Korea decided that market liberalism is just temporary and it has no future. However, so the plan completely stalled. It was suspended. However, since 2004, they have still been some kind of exchanges and seminars between the EU and North Korea to educate the North Koreans mainly about economic reforms and economic opening.
So that on the governmental side of the relationships, there is the initiative that was started, then shut down, and I guess is starting up again, having to do with educating on the governmental side, educating the North Koreans in the direction of market reforms.
That's correct, and yes, absolutely, economic reforms and economic opening, and kind of having seminars and workshops on how it works and how it is going to happen. But as we have seen in the past, David, China has tried and unsuccessfully. We really don't know what's going on in the heads and in the minds of the North Korean leadership. We can all only speculate when it comes to North Korea. We've all been just guessing, basically, for over half a century at this point, what's going to happen and whether or not any of the reforms and openings will be successfully executed.
Petra, in the course of this program so far, we've been able to have a discussion about the examples of the EU and Eastern European private sector investments, businesses in North Korea. And I recognize we don't have the time and perhaps the research involved to vacuum out everything that's going on in terms of the private sector involvement in North Korea, but obviously it's fairly significant from North Korea's perspective.
Absolutely.
Okay, and so what is there are people in the audience now that are probably thinking to themselves, well, these Europeans, they're jumping around the sanctions, they're making money in and around the UN sanctions, but what is the big picture insofar as you're concerned, the value of that type of private sector investment in the country?
Well, I think, David, that the private companies and private sector and businesses can essentially help apply their soft power to North Korea and can explain and can show North Korea, how get them familiar with the Western products and whatnot. And I think that would essentially lead to perhaps accepting, if not opening, accepting certain, market reforms. But we really, like I mentioned before, we really don't know what's going on. And it's unfortunate the European Union at this point, as we all know, has been in a financial crisis. So there is a lot of domestic preoccupation in their 27 capitals trying to kind of figure out
trying to save themselves.
Exactly, what to do. So, it's like that, I think, in the United States as well. Domestic issues are the priority over foreign policy. So I think at this point, the European Union government side, I'm talking about the public sector and governments, is more concerned about their domestic situation than they are about situation abroad. and in terms of the foreign policy sphere. But I'm hopeful that once this passes, we will get back, or Europeans get back and get more involved in terms of North Korea. I mean, only between 1995 and about I think 2005, it's been estimated that the European Union provided up to 400 million euros of food assistance, water supplies, medical supplies, medicine, grains, and fuels to North Korea. And that's not a small number if you think about it. 400 million euros, it goes a long way. And even though it doesn't necessarily mean that much to the Europeans, to North Korea, it's absolutely huge. If you're talking about a country where the GDP is less than $2,000 a year.
Well, I see kind of three connections that the EU and maybe as led by the tip of the spear for the EU would be the former Soviet bloc Eastern European countries.
Oh, absolutely.
I see three things that are in play here. One of them, of course, is the humanitarian aid and assistance. And the next one is the diplomatic relationships that provide the possibility for teaching and pressure for market reforms.
Right.
And then the unusual piece that I want to explore with you a little bit further is this private sector involvement by Eastern European firms, and what do they really mean to the country in terms of stability? I mean, before you answer that question,
sure.
Remember, one of the three things that we started this program with was we were talking about the nuclear proliferation issue,
right.
the human rights issue, and the scary one is the potential for an implosion or humanitarian disaster that takes place. And what's the significance of this private sector investment from the Eastern European countries on those issues? Maybe I don't know there's much on nuclear proliferation that they.
Well, I think that the Eastern European countries certainly have the potential to shape the future of the EU as a whole and North Korea relations. Like I said, we were allies to North Korea, or the Eastern European bloc countries were essentially allies to North Korea during the Cold War. So there have been a lot of the trust issues.
Right. There's a long-standing relationship.
Absolutely, there is a history, and I believe that I personally do believe that this is something that the Eastern European diplomats can apply when it comes to North Korea, and perhaps assist Germany, because Germany is by far naturally the most important trading partner with North Korea. And East Germany, like I mentioned before it unified, it was also of most importance to North Korea in terms of assistance and trading partner.
And the German investment in private sector investment in North Korea is tied into this Korea Computer Center, is it not?
That is correct. That is absolutely correct. And that's the KCC, the Korean Computer Center, and it's important to mention that as well. So North Korea and Germany definitely do have, and it's not just that, David, it's also cars. There we can see a lot of Volkswagens actually.
Volkswagens.
Yes, on the empty streets of Pyongyang that are being used by the elites and by the leadership in North Korea in Pyongyang.
I would guess that there are probably a few Mercedes-Benz in Pyongyang. I haven't been there, but I would guess there are a few that have been imported.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So that type of trade or investment, that type of trade being, Germany exporting autos into North Korea, is a beneficial thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the investment type private sector, like the Korea Computer Center,
right,
that then employs people and provides jobs and salaries and so forth.
That is correct, because when we think about North Korea and investment, I think we see the Kaesong industrial complex that kind of provides all the services and goods, and that where all the things
This is across
assembled.
the DMZ in the south.
That's correct, yes,
Okay.
Absolutely. But there are also opportunities for these smaller companies that will come from, independent from Kaesong, that will start doing their businesses and opening up their ventures in North Korea, in Pyongyang, that are not perhaps that significant, but that can play a huge role in the future when it comes to, businesses with North Korea. Because like I said...
How is that? What's the role that they would play in the future, maybe?
Well, like I mentioned before, and to kind of repeat, there is that trust issue. So North Korea trusts these Eastern European companies a little bit more. And the role that the Eastern European companies can have can essentially lead, to opening, to providing more assistance, to apply the soft power that comes with it, and kind of, slowly but surely. I mean, we've been talking about economic opening since decades at this point, and we really have to understand that when it comes to any kind of changes in North Korea, it will take, what normally takes 1 minute will probably take 10 years when it comes to North Korea, because ultimately the regime survival is number one priority to the North Korean leadership.
Sure.
They will be, they look around and see what happens to China, that the opening of China under Deng Xiaoping and all these reforms, it's a little bit tricky. However, I would point out that we still have an authoritarian regime in China, so, market capitalism or liberalism of an economic opening doesn't necessarily mean that the regime will collapse, as evident in China's example. But North Korea is very, very careful and very suspicious of not applying any new models or economic reforms or openings, because they do not want to collapse. They will be able to maintain their tightly, grasped leadership. And as we've seen, it really is a hereditary, kind of dictatorship from Kim Il-sung to Kim Jong-il to now Kim Jong-un, who is starting to resemble, or who they are trying to make look like his grandfather, the founder of the country. So to go back to your question, I see a huge potential and kind of soft power influence that the Eastern European countries and the European Union as a whole can have on North Korea. And even though European Union does not have a seat at the six-party talk, Brussels has expressed kind of just verbally its political support when it comes to the six-party talk. So the role the EU would like to play, and I believe should be a lot more, it should be a lot more important. And if not a member seat, which is unlikely because six-party talks, we don't have any European countries, it's kind of far away, at least an observer status, and the Europeans can then apply their power and their diplomatic skill set that they've gained during the Cold War to their North Korean counterparts. For instance, even the Soviet Union, the Soviets essentially were not too thrilled about being members at the six-party talks, but the North Koreans asked the Russians to join in. They wanted them to have a seat and representation at the six-party talks because of their long-standing relationship during the Cold War. So I believe that the Europeans, and especially the Eastern European countries, can play a lot more role and can have a greater influence on North Korea and North Korea's decisions, and be kind of the broker, if I may, between North Korea and the West.
Interesting. As I listen to you with this, it's very exciting what you're talking about. I suppose if we think of the whole challenge of the Korean Peninsula, the stability challenge, we have the current actors. Principally the United States,
right.
South Korea, and Japan, and China.
Right.
And to a lesser extent, the Russians. But at least as to the four major players, they have had their push, they use whatever tools they have or they don't have, and we can see the kind of the level of failure so far, and using those existing tools in the toolbox to try to solve that problem, right?
Right.
And so what you're essentially saying, Petra, is that the Eastern European countries are sitting on another set of skills and tools that need to be brought into the picture here to help work
Absolutely.
on this problem. Am I correct?
Absolutely. That's correct. I mean, David, you couldn't have said it any better. I feel that the West, U.S., and like you mentioned, China and South Korea, Japan, Russia should perhaps learn or reach out to these Eastern European countries for their diplomatic support, if anything, because of their long-standing history during the Cold War.
If we take your former homeland
Sure.
as an example, the Czech Republic evolves or gets created after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. And so that country, it seems to me, provides an example for North Korea of how to do it.
Right.
And same with Poland, right?
Right.
And same with a number of other of the former Soviet bloc Eastern European countries, right?
Absolutely. But then again, David, that's correct, how to do it. But like I mentioned, North Korea is utmost, interested in being able to preserve the authoritarian regime because a lot of the Eastern European countries became democracies.
Right. Well, let's focus on this situation with the Czech Republic and other Eastern European countries because are there any of these countries where the regime has held on at all?
No, absolutely not, because in order to be a part of the European Union, you have to have and share the same values, and we are talking about democratic values and human rights and, kind of the norms that are then connected with democracy. And unfortunately, when North Korea looks, or fortunately, when North Korea looks at these former satellite states of Eastern Europe, they understand that there is going to be, or there was a change in the regime. And as I mentioned before, North Korea still, to them, preservation and kind of the authoritarian, the grasp, they want to be able to hold that. So even though we opened up and all the Eastern countries are now part of the European Union and democracies, North Korea does not want to change its regime types. For them, it works.
So what you're saying is, despite the historical relationship, the diplomatic relationship, the private sector investments, one of the hesitating points or component pieces from the North Korean perspective is as they look out to these various examples in Eastern Europe, they're hard pressed to find any country where the regime survived.
That's correct. I mean, there is really nothing in Europe right now, with the exception of Belarus, where Lukashenko is, president of Belarus, is believed to be the last standing dictator.
He's holding on.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
I mean,
okay. So that's and as they look, as the North Koreans look to the Russians, they've seen regime change, although maybe that's arguable a little bit with Putin's so-called re-election, and then as they look to China, and clearly over the period of time, China is not a feudal society or feudal regime like North Korea. They've seen regime change there, and same with Vietnam.
Right.
So there's not a whole lot of examples that they can attach themselves to if they're solely focusing on preservation.
That's correct, and I'm glad you mentioned the former Soviet Union, what's today's Russia, because after 1989 and after the collapse, Russia was really, really poor. They almost became bankrupt, and the economic reforms took a while. Boris Yeltsin was in power. That was kind of a disaster. So Russia today, yes, it is definitely, I would be very careful about labeling the country democracy. I would say probably oligarchy, which is ruled by a few. And we've seen Putin in power, then replaced by Medvedev, and now it's going back to Putin. So it's like Batman, Robin, and Batman. I don't think that Putin actually ever left. And he will be in power until 2024. And the country has, I think, what's kind of preserving this country and the survival continues, it's because of natural gas and because of resources. I feel that without natural resources and gas, the country would be very, very impoverished and not really that important, but yes.
Well, your point of view that you've underscored in this program is the potential soft power that the European countries can and should play in
Right.
trying to assist in stabilizing the Korean Peninsula. What is the role that, from Pyongyang's perspective of with all this historical background, so what is their perspective on how do they see the role that Europe should or could play with
Right.
respect to them?
Well, Pyongyang, North Korea, they will take any chance they can to benefit themselves, right? And I think that the North Korea's leadership has been trying to perhaps play U.S. and other Western countries against each other and extract as much from the Europeans as well as from the U.S. as possible. But this is not successful because, as we know, the West basically sides with each other and the Western countries when it comes to human rights and democratic values and core values and interests. So just like during the Cold War, North Korea tried to play USSR, the Soviet Union, and China against each other. They're still trying to see how much they can get out of it, but not with much success. And I would perhaps even go back and point out that there are still cultural and educational programs that do exist and are in place between some of the Eastern European countries and North Korea. For instance, Czech Republic still has a cultural program in which they send a few students a year to North Korea to study Korean language, and they are placed in a family, or they're staying in. They attend classes and they try to learn about the culture and about a language. However, these programs, David, are not very popular among some of the Czechs and Czech students because the living conditions are really horrendous and are not really comfortable. So,
well, on that point, Petra, this cultural exchange between the Czech Republic and Pyongyang, let me share something with you. I ran into a Czech Republic student who was a part of that whole program, went to Pyongyang for a year or two and became very, very fluent in Korean as it is spoken in North Korea, and just explained to me that it was a fabulous experience, and his perspective was that that this country is going to eventually, it has to change, number one, and number two, when it changes, I want to be. This is not David Day talking. This is this
Sure.
Czech student. I want to be on the cutting edge of some opportunity that's going to arise here, whether I'm based back in Prague or I'm in Pyongyang or both. And I thought it was just fascinating that this cultural exchange could provide an amazing. This gentleman was probably 30 years old.
okay.
And fluent in Japanese, Korean,
Sure.
Czech, English, French, and I'm sure
Oh,
a couple other languages.
Absolutely. No, it's important, I believe, to have cultural exchanges, but also we need to have, and this is not as common when you send North Korea students to Europe or to the United States. Obviously, the country is really poor. Not very many people can afford basic needs, water, food, and let alone speaking about traveling over to the Western world to get educated. So it's definitely difficult, and it's only probably reserved to the sons and daughters of diplomats that are stationed in the United States as well as in some of the European capitals.
So let me now, Petra, let's take a look. Let me ask you to look into your crystal ball as an example here, to look into the future a little bit. And you've talked during the course of this show about the private sector companies that from Europe or from the EU that have invested in North Korea. What do you see in the future? How is that whole investment process? What does it look like to you?
Crystal ball. Let's see. Well, I can, again, when it comes to North Korea, we can only speculate because we really have no idea what's going on in the minds and heads of some of the leaders. But If I had to guess, or if I had to take a look at or take a stab at some of the aspects in the future of EU-North Korea relations, I would imagine that the businesses and private companies will still maintain their operations in North Korea. This should hopefully increase, and if we see successes like DHL, that's been there in 1997, since 1997, the Heineken tobacco joint ventures, I think there is an opportunity for more engagement between North Korea and some of the private sector companies and businesses in European Union.
And that fact alone is a stabilizing opportunity or factor for North Korea. The more private sector investment there is in the country, the better chances that the country will hold if there is a regime change in the future.
Absolutely, and it also provides job opportunities for the North Korean people, and we kind of get a sense or idea of what really is going on within the borders of North Korea, since we don't really know. So not only does it provide jobs, but we also get some kind of an information and from within what the situation truly is like and what it looks like on the inside. So I see that as a good opportunity for the Western countries, to operating with the North Korean government on certain levels. Yes.
This the situation involving the EU and its combat forces. Are there combat forces that the EU has on the Korean Peninsula or in position?
Absolutely not, actually. That's the EU doesn't have a military presence in the Asia Pacific. There are obviously, EU is in some of the member states of the European Union are member states of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But when it comes to active combat forces or military presence on the peninsula, it really is only the United States, and then the ROK troops and the U.S. is kind of stationed throughout the Asia Pacific, but the EU is completely
they're free of that baggage, basically.
Absolutely,
so,
yes.
Okay, let's talk right as we come to the home stretch in this show. Let's talk a little bit about the whole human rights issue. We've talked a lot about. Typically in North Korea situation, there's a nuclear component piece, and then we've talked about the private sector maybe providing some safety net or stability to protect against a humanitarian collapse. But let's talk a little bit about the human rights situation there. What's that like?
David, some of the information that's been coming out from North Korea and situations described by the defectors who were lucky enough to escape from North Korea to China and then to South Korea or elsewhere, it's just horrendous. The political prisoners, gulags, it reminds me of the concentration camps during World War II. There has been, basically anybody who speaks against the regime is executed. If a defector gets caught in China, China usually sends that person back when he then faces a public execution to scare the other members of the village or other people from, preventing them from running across the border to China. So the human rights situation is one of the worst, I believe, in the world, and it's time to kind of take actions as opposed to speak. We all are very well aware of what's going on. Every year, the United Nations adopts sanctions or resolutions and whatnot, but I feel there is so much that needs to be done for the people of North Korea, and it's really sad of what's going on, and I don't see anything really positive within the short term. But perhaps if we start taking actions right now against the horrendous crimes that are being committed on the population in North Korea, then it would work for sure.
Let me ask you one last question, because our time is almost up here. Do you see, Petra, the soft power that the Eastern European countries have with North Korea? Do you see them in the future as being able to assist as a tool in resolving this, or helping with this human rights situation?
I really do believe, David, that they can play a certain level of influence and they can kind of swing things the right direction. I believe that negotiations and talks are very important, that these Eastern European and EU private businesses and companies have certain role they can play in North Korea and, you know, bring about change. And like I mentioned before, it's creating job opportunities as well as getting sense of information of, you know, to the West of how it really works within the country and how it operates. But yes, I believe that the businesses and private sector companies operating in North Korea can, you know, apply their soft power and influence and play a certain role, if I may, in terms of bringing about change. It's, like I said, it's going to be little steps, baby steps, before we see anything substantial. However, it's at this time, I believe it's better something than nothing.
Well, you know, our time is just about up, and I wanted to thank you so much for this wonderful background. And ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed this. You're watching ThinkTech's Asian Review, and we've been talking about the potential influence and help that Eastern Europe could provide in stabilizing the Korean Peninsula. Good night.
Good night. Thank you, David.
You guys are great.
Thank you.
Oh my
Thank you.
God!
It's over.
Ah.